Thanks. Let me just comment. I appreciate the introduction, but, I didn't set out to be some kind of radical lefty, okay? I have actually tried to work in a solid academic fashion. By the way, I am a professor at the University of Southern California at the Annenberg School. And I've written these books in what I thought were thoughtful, well-documented, footnoted way. And what has happened, it seems to me, is not so much that I have failed by being on the left, or Tony Blankley, for that matter, being on the right, but rather that the center hasn't held. The center hasn't been responsible. That's what I meant by no adults watching the store. And I think all of the subjects that I've come here to this group to talk about, what the position that I was advocating, I didn't even give a talk on universal health care. Okay? I mean, that might be a leftist, populist position. My talks have been, why there weren't weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and they had nothing to do with 9/11, and therefore we shouldn't have invaded them. And the result of the invasion, I think one time I came here, I was speaking about the book that I did with my son called The 5 Biggest Lies Bush Told Us About Iraq. And those lies now are well known. One doesn't have to argue about it. And when we look back on it, we see that this invasion, in fact, did not make us stronger, certainly not in this so-called war on terrorism. We brought al-Qaeda to Iraq. And now our government tells us the main danger is Iran. Well, before we overthrew Saddam Hussein, he was the checkmate to Iran, right? They fought bloody wars. And in fact, we have now put people who used to live in Iran in exile, mostly the Shiite leadership, and they are now in power in Iraq. And so we have very vastly expanded the influence of Iran, which was the opposite of what we intended. We certainly have vastly expanded the anger out there in parts of the Muslim world, and there are very few people. There was a BBC roundup on the so-called U.S. departure the other day by a guy who really has covered it more than anyone else, and he says there's almost no one that you can find in Iraq who wants to take the United States to be an ally or a model. Well, that's a very sad comment. And I think, as was mentioned, ramparts, in my life, it seems to me the message is basically, please take your jacket off. Oh. Okay. Well, why am I listening to that? I paid a lot of money for this. I'll accommodate that. I don't know. I guess it's wrestling my microphone. That's what it's doing. But, okay, let me get down to basics here. Okay, let me speak up and really get in here. The point about the adults watching this story is absolutely critical. And this problem that we're experiencing with the economy, as what happened, can you hear me now in the back? Oh boy, this is like going to Leisure World or Laguna Niguel, I can see it happening already. He mumbles, I couldn't hear a word he said, All right, what I'm trying to say is, as with the Vietnam War, as with the Iraq invasion, as with many of our problems, is really not a left-right issue. It's a rather matter of common sense. That doesn't mean we don't have fundamental systemic problems in the society. For instance, in terms of the economy, there are very big issues that should be being debated in terms of our education of our young people, our competitiveness in the world, global warming, the waste of resources. And, I can go through a whole long list of questions on which there is a left progressive position as opposed to a pro-big business position and so forth. None of that had anything to do, really, with this economic meltdown. Okay? Just as we used to argue about Vietnam all the time, why are we in Vietnam? I wrote that pamphlet. And people on the left would say, we're there because of, imperialism. We're there because of resources. We're there because we want blah, blah, blah. No, we were there because of stupidity. There were no resources. There was no international communist conspiracy to take over the world. What happened after we lost in Vietnam? Does anybody know? Remember? Remember we were in Vietnam to stop Chinese communism? Does anybody remember what happened? Okay, we've suffered the most ignominious defeat in American history, and the Vietnamese communists and the Chinese communists went to war. That's what happened. You don't remember? Over some islands that they're still quarreling about in some land? No, they should have known it. The Chinese had occupied Vietnam for 1,000 years. I mean, a few facts would have informed you. And where are the Chinese communists now that were supposed to be the scourge of our existence? They're still communists, but they're carrying our debt, right? And they're better capitalists than we are. So the fact is that reason did not obtain throughout, certainly throughout most of my adult life, whether it was foreign policy or domestic issues. And I met a former student of mine when I was teaching a TA in Berkeley in graduate school who came tonight. I forget your name, but you're here somewhere. He said I gave him an A. Thanked me. So, and I remember back then studying economics in graduate school. One thing that I always found I actually was interested in being an engineer. I didn't really like much of social science, and then because I was good in math, I was given a fellowship and able to go to graduate school in economics. I didn't really know that much about it. But I thought it was sort of odd. Two things that were odd about it. We were discussing economics as if it was divorced from politics. We didn't talk about political economy anymore, or a connection between economics and sociology and anything else. It was all going to be turned into some kind of rarefied science, and math was going to dominate, and we were going to build econometric models, mathematical models of one kind or another, and then this will all be pure science and figure it all out. And our banking meltdown now is a reflection of what happened then. What we call the institutional economists centered at Stanford, very strong, and at Berkeley were wiped out. The people who really put economics in a social setting of how does it impact people and how do actual institutions work. And it was, as I say, turned over to basically the people at places like MIT who did the mathematical modeling. And when you look at the financial meltdown, you see that flight from reality in what was crafted. And so in this situation, I want to start with that point because people talk about this economic meltdown and, we've got 1,000 different explanations. In fact, I begin my book, it's very interesting, something I got out of Paulson's book. Remember Paulson's the man from Goldman, they all come from Goldman Sachs, and became Secretary of Treasury in the Bush administration. And they're sitting and this is from Paulson's book, but they're sitting there in the White House, and President George W. Bush is when the meltdown begins in earnest, and he says, President Bush, how did this happen? Bush, charming, I like his honesty. And there was Paulson, and Paulson said, really honest, an honest answer that few have given from the banking community. He said, it was a humbling question for someone from the financial sector to be asked. After all, we were the ones responsible. Secretary Paulson. It's in his book. Now, that's an honesty you won't find from Robert Rubin, who also came from Goldman Sachs into an administration, then went out to Citigroup. You won't find it from many. And what they do instead is they say, oh, we don't know. Who saw it coming? Hindsight is everything. There were many factors. It's the normal fluctuation in the business cycle, or it's the tulip craze, or it's this or that or that or that. How could we know? And my book is a very specific refutation of that idea. As I begin, I said, they did it. Yes, there is a they. The captains of finance, their lobbyists and allies among leading politicians of both parties who together destroyed an American regulatory system that had been functioning splendidly for most of the 6 decades since it was enacted in the 1930s. The subtitle of my book is How Reagan Republicans and Clinton Democrats Enriched Wall Street While Mugging Main Street. Now, when we look for how this happened, the polls tell us people are looking everywhere but where they should be looking. For instance, there's a whole gang that wants to blame Obama. And Obama inherited, the recession was on for 13 months, this deep recession, before he was even in office. Yet somehow half the people polled, some large number blame him. The other half blamed George W. Bush. And I'm not loath to blame George W. Bush for anything, but I don't think he bears primary responsibility for this. What he does bear responsibility is for getting the nation all distracted with an excessive and irrational response to 9/11 and ignoring the economic meltdown as it was occurring. That is certainly true. And instead of dealing with the 9/11 attack in terms of police work and targeted response and so forth, he went to war, revved up the Pentagon budget. We spend more now in real dollars than we ever did during the height of the Cold War on a military machinery to defeat guys who bought their arsenal at places like Home Depot for $150.